The running order tonight, we're going to start with a prayer. We'll watch the Global Healing video, and we're very happy to have our main speaker, Jane Mellett from GCCM, talking tonight. And then we'll have a time for reflection, followed by a question and answer session with questions from the chat box, and then we're going to wrap up with a prayer. So last week we focused on the beauty of creation with Bishop John Arnold and Dr. Carmody Gray, which you can watch again. The link will be in the handout. And this week we will be focusing on the call to ecological conversion. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Colette Joyce from Westminster Diocese to lead us in a prayer.
Hello everybody. We're working our way around the diocese, and I'm also joined tonight by John from Southwark and David later on this evening from Leeds. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis said, "If the simple fact of being human moves people to care for the environment of which they are a part, Christians in their turn realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. It is good for humanity and the world at large when we believers better recognize the ecological commitments which stem from our convictions." As we gather tonight in this season of Lent, our hearts are turning towards Christ. Turn, O Lord, our hearts also towards the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Transfigure us, O Lord, that we might see you in the glory of creation and in each and every one of our brothers and sisters.
Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain where they could be alone by themselves. There in their presence, he was transfigured. His clothes became dazzlingly white, whiter than any earthly bleacher could make them. Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter spoke to Jesus. "Rabbi," he said, "it is wonderful for us to be here, so let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. And a cloud came, covering them in shadow. And there came a voice from the cloud, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him."
We pray together. God of love, you call us to transform your world so that all might flourish, to act justly and with hope so that all might live in peace. May we answer your call. Lord of hope, you call us to care for the earth and its people so that all might flourish, to love tenderly and generously, so that all might have enough. May we answer your call.
Thank you very much, Colette and your team. We're now going to watch the Global Healing documentary. So if I could remind everybody to turn off their cameras until after the documentary, just to help with the bandwidth.
The facts about pollution, waste, and the effects of our throwaway culture are unarguable. Our sister Earth is groaning, crying out under the weight of humankind's often reckless and sinful disregard for our fragile life support system. The planet is being squeezed dry beyond every limit.
We're given creation to look after, to use for good ends, and for that use, we will be held accountable. We will be answerable. We carve up everything that exists for our ownership. We share it all out, and we take possession of it. He calls this the attitude of masters, consumers, and ruthless exploiters.
We have created literally millions of tons of plastic. It's polluting the ocean, and it's also polluting the groundwater that we actually drink. The earth is beginning to look like a pile of filth. He doesn't say, well, they're not great things to do. He said, sorry, they're sins.
Isn't it staggering that in the 21st century, over 1 billion people don't have access to clean water? That really is a scandal in our day, and we need to change it because it doesn't need to be a problem.
The cry of creation is just as real as the cry of a human being lying on the pavement, asking for help. We need to reconnect. There's something missing from our lives if we don't have it.
When I grew up, it was, the city was the place to be. It was exciting, and countryside was just boring. Like, why would you want to go there? But now I feel it feeds me, I guess I could say. Like, spiritually, emotionally, it feeds into me somehow.
I've always experienced a very deep connection with nature, with all creatures. I had a very deep love for animals as a little girl. And I experienced the gift of life and the gift of love that comes from God.
Anybody that would argue that there isn't intelligent design in creation, I think they're crazy. We produce enough food on this planet to feed 10 billion people, yet we still have starving people. And a lot of the world's food that is produced gets fed to animals. And it takes a lot more food to feed an animal than it does to feed a human. I was really convicted that what was going onto my plate was affecting the whole of humanity, and so I had to just put a stop to it. They say if that we continue the way this world system, the way it's happening now, by 2050 we'll need 3 planets to survive. It makes no sense whatsoever. And not only that, by 2050 they estimate that there'll be between 150 million and 200 million climate refugees. The thing with what's happening with the world is that it's actually an incredible opportunity for humanity, because we're facing one of the greatest disasters of our time, which is climate change. And if we fix this as a human race, then we can create unity. It's an opportunity, and we all have a choice. We all have a daily choice to make a change.
Pope Francis in chapter 6 of Laudato Si declares with great faith, all is not lost. However, this much-needed message of hope comes with a personal challenge. Much needs to change in the world, but above all, it is we humans who need to change the most. The Pope is calling each and every single one of us to undergo an ecological conversion, a radical change of heart.
The Pope says that all of us need a personal conversion to Jesus Christ. And I know that's true from my own life and, of course, in my work of evangelization. But the Pope then goes on to say something like this: if that conversion doesn't affect the way we see and treat the planet, we're not fully converted. Ouch.
My conversion to Christ isn't simply about my relationship to him. You know, if you're going to get the order of your life right, then that is going to include your relationship with the created order and the goods of this world.
How many of us have gone to confession to confess the fact that we didn't recycle yesterday? Most of us don't really think we shouldn't fly. We'll still buy a weekend break if the tickets are cheap. We think, oh, it's only 50 quid. It's not only 50 quid, it's the earth.
I understand that our choice comes from a voice that talks to us inside. And when we find that truth, there is no compromise.
I think that there's a direct connection between how we are choosing to live and our faith, because our choice, we hope, is reducing suffering on the planet with the animals, but also with the rising climate, the rising sea levels. It's all going to affect the human race. And our choice really it doesn't seem like a choice. We have no choice because we've learned a truth and we have to respond to that. As a Christian, as a Catholic, you have to respond where there is suffering.
So to me, it's very simple. By reconnecting with the message of Jesus, I'm able to understand the path that I need to take.
Yeah, I think that when you make the right choice, you feel you've done the right thing, and I don't feel that I've lost out in any way by making better choices. I think actually it feeds my spirit.
It's that click that happens inside, and once it happens, you're different, you're changed. It is a conversion.
It's so hard to imagine what changes would actually take place in our lives if we saw plants and animals genuinely in Christ. All of us, every single time we spend money, we are casting a vote for the kind of world we want. There is no non-moral purchase. Most of us are still more interested in getting the best deal and eating stuff we want than we are in responsible consumption. Every single time we go to the supermarket, we are involved in treating well or mistreating plants and animals. If I could actually see what my money was going to support, would I be able to look God in the eye and say, I was respecting your world? Probably not. I have friends who have absolutely no economic excuse, who are buying eggs from caged hens. How can they justify that? Probably just because they've never really thought about it. But in the situation of the world that we now face, ignorance is not good enough. It means that when you see the absolutely desperately awful sight of rows and rows and rows of packets of meat in the supermarket, which come off the backs of dreadful, miserable, horrible, tiny little lives, lived out in the midst of utter cruelty and degradation. When you see that, you see human sin. That's what we should see. Because those creatures are loved by Jesus. We don't get to do that to them. Pope Francis says, we have no right. We have no right to do that.
The way that we live our lives is a bit different, perhaps, but it's the way of the future in my mind. And in a world that seems to be obsessed with leaving your mark on this planet, Our whole ambition is to not leave any mark at all. And we try to live a life where it's as if we didn't exist. When we're gone, nobody knows we were here. And if everybody did that, the planet would be as it was in the beginning.
To me, St. Francis brings us back to the core, to a deep knowledge of creation as a gift from God that we need to care for, we need to love, we need to deeply respect.
I remember talking once to a Franciscan brother, and he said that they try to live with the least needed rather than the most permitted. And I found that just so beautiful. And I think that's a bit of a mantra for us as well.
We really can get into a way of thinking that the things that I do don't ultimately make any difference. Pope Francis's principle is, nothing is too small. No action is too insignificant to be worth the effort. And that's as tiny as walking instead of driving, turning the light out, putting a hedgehog house in my garden. You know, I mean, it's the very mundane details of life. That's how the world actually changes, is by everybody making those decisions.
It's easy, in the busyness of our everyday lives, to be faithful churchgoers and yet lose sight of the wider implications of our faith. The gospel has direct consequences for our way of thinking, feeling, and our living. Sustaining a healthy relationship with creation is a vital dimension of our overall personal and communal conversion to Jesus Christ. Pope Francis says that only then will we fully know why we are here, and the true purpose of our life on earth, and the goal of our work and efforts. He promises that by undergoing this ecological conversion, we will all become a more compassionate presence in our world.
There were some really, I think you'll agree, some really hard-hitting points in that, worthy of quite a bit of pondering, and I hope there'll be some really interesting questions around that later on. So next, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening. So we've got Jane Mellett. So Jane is the Laudato Si Officer for Trocare, which is the Overseas Development Agency of the Catholic Church in Ireland. She also works for the Global Catholic Climate Movement, otherwise known as GCCM, as a support to Laudato Si animators in Europe. She is a member of the Laudato Si Working Group of the Irish Bishops' Conference, and in 2018, Jane embarked on a climate pilgrimage, walking 1,000 kilometers from Italy to Poland to the UN climate talks in Katowice, carrying the message of Laudato Si. So, welcome, Jane.
Thanks very much, John Paul. And yeah, apologies about the video. I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but when we send out the recording, we'll have the top quality version in it. So I'm delighted to be here with you again this evening, and fantastic to see so many people here. As we explore the theme for this evening, the call to eco conversion. So I'm just going to share some slides, and hopefully these work. And if there's a problem, someone can interrupt me. So as John Paul mentioned, all of my work involves sharing Laudato Si with faith communities across the island of Ireland, but also through GCCM's work globally also. I'm quite lucky that I get to spend my time on this area. And as I'm sure you're aware, Laudato Si calls every person on this planet to a deep eco-conversion, a radical change of heart, where our relationship with God's creation is concerned. And it urges us to listen to the signs of the times in the light of the gospel, specifically to listen to the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, to listen to the science, to listen to the call of our faith and to explore where we're being called to, and to listen to the youth of the world. There's a lot of radical calls in Laudato Si, and we're just going to explore a couple of them with you this evening. I want to share a little bit about my own eco-conversion story. As John Paul mentioned, in 2018, I went on a walk, a very long walk. I was invited to join a group of pilgrims who were walking from Rome, from the Vatican, to the UN climate talks, which were taking place that year in Poland, COP24. And I joined these pilgrims in northern Italy and walked 1,000 kilometers with them across 6 countries in the middle of winter, sharing the message of Laudato Si with all of the communities and the people that we met. We'd quite many difficulties on our journey, but it was also a very profound journey for me especially. It was one that really opened my eyes to the realities of the climate crisis. I'd always been concerned about social justice issues and what our faith could speak into those issues and the role of our faith communities. And I suppose when Laudato Si was published, it had quite a deep impact on me in sense of its fresh spirituality and theology. But this walk opened my eyes to the reality and the painful awareness of what is happening to our world. The pilgrims I walked with were from many different countries, but quite a few of them were from the Philippines. And as I'm sure you're aware, the Philippines is one of those countries which is on the front lines of the climate and environmental crisis. And I want to share with you this evening one of their stories. This is Joanna Sustento. She's from Tacloban City in the Philippines. And you may remember back in 2013, the strongest typhoon ever recorded in human history made landfall at Ground Zero in Tacloban City. It killed 10,000 people in 2 hours. It displaced 14 million people across the archipelago of the Philippines. And Joanna quite literally lost everything that night. Her parents, her brother, her sister-in-law, and her little 3-year-old nephew. And as Joanna walked with us on this climate pilgrimage and I got to know her and we became friends, I began to realize that we all need to really hear and see the stories of what this crisis actually looks like in real time, real people, real faces, real devastation, real grief. And I have a short video that I want to share with you and let Joanna tell you her story. And it's just 2 minutes and hopefully this works for us.
From the biggest of tragedies, hope can be found. My name is Joanna Sustento. I had a happy life, a good job, great friends, and a wonderful, loving family. But in a matter of minutes, all of that changed. For those who experienced Haiyan, the strongest typhoon ever recorded, it was apocalyptic. I witnessed my mother, my father, brother, sister-in-law, and my 3-year-old nephew being swept away by the storm surge. It left my brother and me to search for our family's bodies in the aftermath. We never found our father and our nephew. It's difficult to be the one left behind. You have to deal with all the questions, the grief, the pain, and the regrets. Typhoon Haiyan killed more than 10,000 people and left over 14 million people homeless. But it's not just statistics and numbers in a news report. This is about us, the people. Climate change affects everyone. People around the world are now taking a stand and fighting for a basic human right to a stable, safe, and healthy climate. Typhoon survivors and other frontline communities in the Philippines and Pacific Islands, Indigenous peoples in Canada, Swiss grannies and United States youth, Norwegian and Dutch plaintiffs, allied organizations, and Greenpeace supporters. These are just some of the people rising above the challenges of the climate crisis and reaching for a better future for us all. We are already proving to the world and to ourselves that this story does not end there.
So although Joanna carries a very painful story with her, Joanna's story is one of the story of millions of people around our world who are currently on the front lines of this ecological crisis. And I promised Joanna that I would share her story whenever I give a talk, whenever I speak. I share that story because, as I said, part of this eco-conversion, this waking up to hear the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, involves seeing the faces and the people behind the statistics. And as Christians, we're called to love of neighbor. And my question is, what does love of neighbor look like in an era of ecological breakdown? And that's part of this journey to eco-conversion, to having a deep change of heart where our relationship with the earth is concerned. How can I be neighbor to Joanna? How can I be neighbor to my brothers and sisters who are suffering around the world because of this crisis? So we're invited as part of this conversion to see those on the front lines, the victims of climate disasters, the displacement of peoples, those who suffer famine from drought, water and food insecurity, and so on. Because we know in the Gospels that Jesus always sides with the oppressed, the preferential option for the poor, and we're called into this also. So while I was on the climate pilgrimage, I learned so much as we walked, especially through the areas of Poland where there are so many fossil fuel plants, coal mostly. I was quite startled when we got to the COP to realize that the actual UN talks were being sponsored by 6 fossil fuel companies. Learning that only 100 fossil fuel companies in the world are responsible for 70% of the emissions that are driving this crisis. And all of these facts and statistics can be overwhelming. And Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, he says, our goal is to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what's happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and then to discover what each of us can do about it. And it is a very painful journey, because once you start to see these things, you can't unsee them. You might wish that you could, but you can't. You start to notice this everywhere around you. So as we listen to the cry of the earth, the suffering of the earth becomes more and more apparent. On top of the climate crisis, we know our world is facing a very serious biodiversity crisis. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis reminds us that we shouldn't just think of all of the different species as resources for our use. He says they have value in themselves, and the great majority become extinct mainly because of human activity. He says, because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. And he says, we've no right to do this. So we hold all the elements of the ecological crisis in this eco-conversion that we're invited into. The recent Living Planet report said we've lost 68% of wildlife since 1970 due to human activity. That's a frightening statistic, that we're in the 6th mass extinction of life on this planet due to human activity. Laudato Si doesn't leave us in this painful space. We have to sit there for a while, but we also have to move out of it, to move into a deep reflection and action. And it might seem a strange place to start, but Laudato Si invites us, first of all, back into the spaces that we love in nature. This is a picture of me and my friends climbing Carrantoul, which is Ireland's highest mountain. a couple of years ago, and my happy place in nature is in the mountains. It's where I definitely feel close to God, feel close to nature. And I suppose I'd ask you this evening, where are these spaces for you? Where's your favorite place in nature? And to bring that to mind now and to think about what that place means to you and what senses are evoked when you're there. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you touch? And Laudato Si tells us to go back to these spaces and begin there, because Pope Francis says we've lost this sense of connection with the natural world. He says the ecological crisis is first and foremost a spiritual crisis. And he urges us to go back to these spaces that we love, that we connect with, so that we can rekindle this sense of awe and wonder with creation. So we hold the painful awareness of the crisis on one hand, but we also must connect back in and rekindle that sense of connection and awe and wonder. And there are beautiful passages in Laudato Si to help us. Thomas Berry says we need to move from a spirituality of alienation from the natural world to a spirituality of intimacy with the natural world. From a spirituality of the divine as revealed in words to the divine revealed in the world around us. And St. Francis also, the patron saint of ecology, invites us to see nature as a magnificent book in which God speaks to us and grants us a glimpse of his infinite beauty and goodness. So part of this conversion experience is looking out at the world and seeing God's hand in all of it, and to connect more deeply in with this spirituality. He says the entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. Soil, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. So as we're in this lockdown period, especially, where are the spaces we can go to connect with nature and to see everything from the blades of grass to the stars in the sky as a caress of God. We need to connect back in with the mystery of all of creation. And in the documentary, David spoke about looking out at God's creation, seeing the design, but seeing more than that, seeing that it's the handiwork of a loving creator. And these beautiful passages from Laudato Si that really speak to me. Creation is the order of love. God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things. This love which moves the sun and the stars. So as we look up at a night sky, instead of feeling overwhelmed by its, by the awesomeness of it, to feel connected to all that exists, to see God's fingerprints in it all. Another part of this eco-conversion experience for me is this really important question that we're asked in Laudato Si, where Pope Francis says, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? And this is a question that the youth climate movement and young people all over the world are asking of us now also. This is a question of intergenerational justice. So this conversion experience holds the painful awareness, the deep spirituality, and the questions of intergenerational justice and solidarity as we move forward. Pope Francis says Christians need an ecological conversion where the effects of their encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. Living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It's not an optional or secondary aspect of our Christian experience. So while in the past, maybe care for creation came sort of last on the list at the parish meeting or whatever it might be, or it's like, oh, we'll get to that when we get all the other stuff done. No, this has to be an integral part of everything that we do. Our liturgies, our prayer, our worship, our activism in our homes, with our families, schools. And he says St. Francis shows us the way. He shows us the model, a clue of what it's like to begin this journey, to look out at the world with the familial love, brother, sun, sister, moon, and so on. So there's a paradox here. We have to go fast because of the urgency of the crisis, but we also need to go slow because this experience involves reconnecting to this deep spirituality that we need to rekindle in prayer and in deep reflection. So just before I finish, what's the role of our faith communities in this? An Irish theologian that you're probably familiar with, Donald Dorr, has a new book out, and I just borrowed some quotes from him and his wisdom within that. He says, we need an ecological spirituality which can engage with the environmental crisis our world is facing. And he says, we don't paste this on like icing on a cake. It has to be at the very heart of all that we do. And this will give us nourishment and life. There's a revolution that needs to happen. It starts from inside each one of us. We need to wake up and fall in love with the earth again. And he says, if religious communities, faith communities, joined hands with popular movements, they may well be able to provide the momentum that's needed for us to move forward, because faith communities transcend nation states and they acknowledge the long-term responsibilities, the intergenerational element. So the networks that we have as faith communities, there aren't many other examples of those types of networks in our world. So we can achieve quite a lot. We also get hope from our spirit, from our Christian faith. It gives us spiritual energy needed to work for change, even when things seem quite hopeless. And Donald says, down through Christian history, there's been a succession of heroic people who've been inspired by Jesus and led by his spirit to follow his example in taking on tasks that we might seemed impossible. And they challenge us to do the same now. Hope would have us recognize there's always a way out, that we can always redirect our steps and always do something to solve our problems. The present world system is certainly unsustainable. And when I was on the climate pilgrimage, I did find a lot of hope, active hope, and it wasn't necessarily in the halls of the UN conference, but it was in the people that we met on our journey, in the schools, the parishes, the faith communities that we met along the way, who were doing what they could, where they are, to effect change. This is how the crisis will be solved, from the grassroots. And Greta Thunberg says, hope is found in action. She says, when we start to act, hope is everywhere. So instead of looking for hope, look for action, and then the hope will come. And I've certainly found that to be true in the activities that I'm involved with. This is an image of an interfaith group in Dublin right before the largest climate protest in history in Dublin took place in September 2019. And we gathered and we prayed together before the protest began. And it was just a wonderful experience of interfaith solidarity, reading from the different scriptures and passages on caring for the earth. And we hope going forward to create more spaces like this. I find hope here. I find hope when I see parishes signing up to things like Live Simply or Eco Church Awards. I find hope when I see young people calling out their politicians to account on the failure to address this crisis. I find hope when I see a parish turning their lawn into a wildflower meadow, or when people gather to support the Fridays for Future movement online or in person. I find hope when parish centres implement recycling stations, or when people of faith come together to plant trees to mark special occasions. I find hope when our liturgies lament the destruction of biodiversity and when our prayers invite communities to respond to the cry of the earth. Wherever people are living out the call of Laudato Si to embrace a profound interior conversion where our relationship with God's creation is concerned, hope is certainly there. So I leave you with two suggestions for Lent. Usually we might attend a reconciliation service or something similar on our Lenten journey, and we mightn't be able to do that at the moment, but we can certainly enter into an examine where our relationship with the world is concerned. And this wonderful website, ecologicalexamine.org, which is produced by the Jesuits, has lots of questions to guide us on our way. They invite us first to gratitude, to give thanks to God for all of creation. At the end of each day, to ask ourselves, where did I feel the presence of God in creation today? We start with gratitude. We also need to ask for the grace to see creation as God does, in all its splendor and suffering. To ask ourselves, do I see the beauty of creation and hear the cries of the earth and the poor? And also to look closely at how our life choices impact on creation and the poor. And this is challenging. It can bring joy, but it's also deeply challenging. the joy we experience when we ask ourselves this question, or maybe it's more of a challenge. Questions such as, how can I turn away from a throwaway culture? So I just point you towards this deeper reflection during Lent. The second thing I'd like to invite you to this evening is an Laudato Si animators course, which is run by the Global Catholic Climate Movement. And it's a wonderful online free course that you can do to explore these issues more deeply, to gather with a global community in prayer and reflection, and to find out ways you can take action in your faith community. And the next training begins in April, so it might be something that you would consider, and we'll certainly send out the links with the next email that goes out to you all. Pope Francis says everyone's talents and involvement are needed to address this crisis. And I'm going to pause here, and I have a piece of music to play to help us reflect, but I always finish with this poem, which I love, from Drew Dillinger, and you may have heard it before, but maybe just to take a breath as I read it, and then we'll have a little piece of music. And I just invite you to sit with all that you have heard so far this evening, and maybe to ask what question or thought is coming for you. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, as the mammals, reptiles, and birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protests when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew?
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for your talk. There's so much in it. I've made pages and pages of notes, and now I can't read my own writing. And for that moment of reflection as well, which we've got, I'd like to invite Marie Weeks to unmute herself. I believe she's got a further reflection on her own ecological conversion to share with us. So Marie is one of our Laudato Si animators.
Hi, John Paul. Thank you. Brilliant talk, Jane. That was amazing. Well done. Yeah, basically, I was invited to almost give, I suppose, the opposite side of Jane's eco conversion was incredibly planned and prepared for, and this great walk across Europe and the boots of God knows how much training she must have done. Mine, I have to admit, was a result of some absolutely terrible parenting when I turned up to the wrong place thinking that it would be a really good idea to convert my two very reluctant teenagers to have a moral conscience. Obviously, it didn't go well. So we turned up at a little church hall in Bristol, and the first thing that happened when they walked in was both of them got their phones out and sat down and proceeded to completely ignore everything that was going on around us. I was thinking, oh my godfathers, what have we done? And suddenly appears a priest called Augusto Zampini. So there was me sitting there at the wrong gig. Augusto Zampini is one of the major papal representatives, absolutely directly responsible for Laudato Si. And it was at that point, by complete accident and a major mess on my part, that I saw this particular slide. Jane, could you put up the first slide if that's okay? Okay, he showed us this slide, and that was the point where it suddenly occurred to me that actually being into ecology and being into sort of the environment and stuff like that was not what I thought it was. I'd done the whole watch David Attenborough thing and felt really emotional at the end in the last 15 minutes and seeing these piles of plastic on the beaches in certain countries and thought that must be terrible to have to live next door to. But what I hadn't seen before and what I really had not put together was the link between the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. I mean, turning up to see Augusto Zampini at a little tiny parish hall in the middle of Bristol was literally like turning up at Blackpool Tower, paying a £5 to get in and Led Zeppelin playing. It was just absolutely ridiculous. The man was amazing. But the thing that he brought home to us was that it was our responsibility to look at this and to sort of see what the effects that our actions were having. And this was genuinely the first time. This slide was my turning point because I was like, what? That's actually what I'm doing, my contribution. It was the first time, to be honest, that I'd seen my actions and choices and habits and put that together with consequences to the very people that I genuinely thought I was actually protecting when I was putting money in this or doing a sponsored that or making a big deal about doing some triathlon for God knows what with somebody. I know I don't look like a triathlete. We'll just leave that. We'll gloss over it. But do you see what I mean? It's the consequences. I had not seen the consequences to my actions in the habits in my life. So just things that were striking about this was things like, you know, every time I bought a chicken burger for the girls, those chickens being fed on soya, that the Amazon was being absolutely obliterated so that the soya could be grown cheaply to feed the animals that I was feeding to my kids. Things like my desire to have a Nescafe Gold blend as my treat, when actually what was going on? Why wasn't I buying fair trade? It tastes the same. If I don't like it, put a bit of sugar in. So it was kind of that was my real wake up call. And that really was the moment where I started realizing that my responsibility to the poor was not actually to go out and do these massive things once a year, or when my mate said, let's sponsor you for this. My responsibility for the poor was every single time I walked into a supermarket and put my hand out. My responsibility is what I do with my hands into the basket, if I can walk instead of take the vulva out, you know, it's those sort of things. I just wanted to quickly, there's two more things. Slide 2, could you pop that up, please, Jane, if that's okay? This is by Kodor, who was a priest who was an artist. I think he was in a concentration camp during World War II. Call me out if I'm wrong on that. The reason why I absolutely love this, and it's not that clear in this particular slide, but this is the face we're familiar with, Veronica wiping the face of Jesus, the picture we're familiar with. Now, if you look very, very carefully into the face of Jesus, when you see the hands holding the bowl, you can actually see the face of somebody in the face of Jesus. There's a face of somebody who is poor in that face. And to me, this picture absolutely sums up, again, my responsibility and my link towards not feeling a bit sad when I watch David Attenborough and the whales are dying out, but my link to my actions and the people at the other side of it, you know, my brothers and sisters, basically, that I am paying no attention to because of my rush around the planet doing what is easy for me. I just wanted to counteract my rather inadequate waffle and really not pitching it very intellectually by a couple of just a few sentences written by Einstein, which I think really, really sums up the whole thing. He says, and this is the last bit, a human being is part of the whole called the universe, a part limited by time and space. One experiences oneself, one's thoughts and one's feelings as something separate from the rest of a kind of optical delusion of one's consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for the few people nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Now, I think if Einstein said it, and he's very clever, we should probably take a little bit of notice. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for putting up with me, and yeah, let's go for it. Thank you. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Marie. I don't think that was inadequate waffle at all. I think that was actually adequate enthusiasm, I would call that. Definitely. And thank you for the bit of Einstein, which I think actually I'd quite like to lead on from Einstein. We're going to have our question and answer now, and I'd invite you all to put your questions to Jane in the chat box, and Ed and Ellie will be reading through and picking some questions. But while that's happening, if I could ask Jane a first question, leading on from Einstein and his what he was talking about with these personal desires, perhaps in a slight negative way. There was lots in your talk that I felt was really, really hopeful, and kind of actually there were bits that really got me quite excited. And actually, you know, not all personal desires are bad. Like, for instance, you know, the walk. For instance, I got quite excited about this idea of the walk and finding your own personal place, you know, where you know, and it brings us back to this finding you know, the beauty in creation from last episode. So really, it's, you know, and going back to what you said about the, you know, what's the church's role in this? How, you know, I think my question is, what is the church's responsibility in helping people find this correct desire to be in nature and amongst, you know, help, you know, finding. I'm waffling.
That's okay. Thanks, John Paul. Yeah, it's a great question. What is the church's role? And I think all of us here are church in this online community this evening. So there's our role, and there's the role of the institutional church and faith communities in general. I suppose I'll start with the institutional church. I think there are many exciting things happening since Laudato Si was published. Pope Francis is definitely a global leader on climate, and he's recognized as such around the world, believers and non-believers. There's a huge gift in Laudato Si. So the first role of the church, as I see it, is to spread that theology and spirituality in our faith communities. And often in Ireland, people say to me, I've never heard of Laudato Si. It was published 5-6 years ago. Why didn't I hear about this in my parish? And that's an issue.
And what do you think on the internet?
So, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, Grant. So I think that's one of the most important roles of the church is to share this wisdom and this spirituality with people. We have access to huge communities. Someone said to me recently that in their parish down in West Cork, mass attendance might be dwindling, but it's still the largest gathering of people in that town every week. So we have access to so many people, to so many networks, the schools and parishes networks, when you think of the vastness of it, that the church needs to be sharing this wisdom with people through our liturgies, prayer, worship, whatever way we can. So that's a real important thing to mention, and the season of creation, which is celebrated in September, is one really concrete example of how we can do that as church. And I'll mention a second piece, which is a good news story for the church. There is a huge divestment movement out there, divesting from fossil fuels. And in 2018, the Irish bishops divested as a conference from the fossil fuel industry. And I think over 50 congregations in Ireland have done the same. So that has direct impact on an industry that's driving this crisis. And the divestment movement globally is vast, and is very successful. But within that movement, faith communities make up the largest percentage in the global divestment movement. I think 40% of that movement are faith communities, and the church is part of that. So to really think about what we're doing with our assets as church, with our land, the land use around a parish, a graveyard, a school, and so on. So we have power as faith communities, and it's how to use that in order to affect change in a really positive way. Through our prayer and spirituality, but also through our activism. That was a bit of a long answer, but there you go.
It was brilliant, thank you. And there was half of the question I was trying to ask, but couldn't work out how to do it, because there's the being in nature, but there's also the being amongst the poor, which is a more difficult thing. But actually, like you mentioned, the communities that are naturally there, in our faith communities, every time we gather for mass, we are in some sense encountering each other, which is again, I think, a very powerful thing for that our faith communities can offer in this idea of ecological conversion. So thank you. So Ed and Ellie, do we have any questions for Jane?
Yeah, should I go first? So thanks again for Jane and Mary. Both of your testimonies were really powerful, and I think it picks up on one of the questions that popped up in the chat around. So an ecological conversion is a really intensely personal thing, and something that we almost individually go through. So how can we avoid feeling inadequate when our neighbours and our friends and family aren't responding in the same way, and how can we inspire them?
Great question. I'd be lying if I said I had a suspicion that when I came back from the climate pilgrimage, a lot of my friends thought I maybe had lost my mind. But on a serious note, our own personal conversion is one thing, but often the conversion of people around us is the hardest thing, especially our families. Going home to parents and siblings and trying to encourage little things in the household can often be the hardest thing to do. But I think, like, as part of this eco conversion piece, once we're witnessing to something, like, we have to start with ourselves. And once you witness to something, that has a far greater effect, in my experience, than giving someone a lecture in the pub or whatever. And you might need both, but I think we do have to model the way a little bit in this, first of all, and encouraging really small actions like planting wildflowers in the parish grounds or in the front of the house. And people would say to me, there's 100 companies burning the planet to the ground and you are talking about planting wildflowers. Yes, because you have to start small with what you have and where you are. And that grows. Never underestimate the power of small actions. They have a ripple effect and an energy that moves out through the community, and people around you see that. So they're places I'd start, but I can absolutely you know, empathize. This isn't easy. So you do need support, and that's where gathering with like-minded people is really important. Like, find your tribe in this, 2 or 3 people who are on a similar journey, to nourish and sustain you and to support you when you might be, that hopelessness creeps in. Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. Edward, do you have a question as well?
Yeah, there's quite a few questions.
Oh, close it. You don't need a sound. Ooh. Oh God, no. This one. This one. Yeah, but you want that.
There's quite a few questions in the chat box there about, I suppose, ethically spending our money and the best way to go about doing that. And I suppose it's really quite a confusing topic when you get into the supermarket and you're confronted with just a huge range of items. How do you even go about starting that thought process of buying the right thing or spending your money correctly? What sort of advice would you have for people on that?
Yeah, this is another interesting one, but I'd say one thing first of all is I never laid the enormity of the climate crisis at an ordinary person's door. Just to say that first of all, I think we need to remember the enormous corporations and industries that are involved in the destruction of our environment. That's the first thing I'd say. Then second to that is we each have a responsibility. So we have to start with ourselves, and it's about our personal relationship with the world. So we do have to look at our own lifestyles, but to hold both of them, it's just important to say that first of all. Spaces where you can find out information about ethical shopping. I'm not based in the UK, and there's people on this call who are, that might have really helpful answers to this question. But I do vaguely remember, did Live Simply a few years ago produce a guide around what products that they were advising to avoid. I may be wrong in that, but simple things like palm oil, we know, is driving the destruction of the rainforests. So just looking out for products that might contain that is an example, and just doing a little bit of research about where your coffee comes from, or are you buying fair trades, and little things like that, starting there. And as you start to do that, your knowledge in the area will grow, and there's plenty of groups online that have information around ethical consumerism and things like that. So it's just being a little bit more aware, starting with a few areas, and you'll find that knowledge just expanding, and just doing research, contacting organizations, asking for advice. I think that's the best approach.
Brilliant, thank you, Jane. So an ongoing ecological conversion as products and the sign of the times change around us, I think is important. I wondered whether Maria Elena, who I know is in the audience, might be able to answer the question about Live Simply.
I may or may not be right.
I don't believe you are right, Jane.
Sorry about that.
There have been some wonderful Live Simply cookbooks that have been done by different parishes. But as far as I recall, I saw in the chat, and I would also recommend The Ethical Consumer, who have kind of written about it. And there are lots of online groups as well, in terms of looking at kind of the most ethical. Tradecraft is also great, another great way of going for certain kinds of staples and foods that come from developing countries. yeah, no calories in fair trade chocolate. But yes, I'd have to say that there are spaces online. But maybe for the next Live Simply update next month, I need to find something to share with some of our Live Simply organisers. I will take it on board.
Thanks.
Thank you, Maria Elena. And thank you, Jane and Marie, for your talks. We're going to hand over now, before we wrap up, to Karen and Liz, who have some closing remarks and information on the handout for this week.
Hi, yes. Hi, thank you, John Paul. So this week's handout, which is coloured green this time, contains a prayer and a quote from Laudato Si again, and also a link to an invigorating and inspiring song called Enough is Enough, which has been composed with the express purpose of inviting choirs, street bands and community groups to learn and perform it as a collective musical response to COP26, which, as you know, will be held in Glasgow in November 2021. There's also a link to a short, profound interview with Dr. Carmody Gray. And there are links to some incredible resources on a website called Journey to 2030 with ideas for action. And there are links to news articles, including a wonderful story, which is essentially an echo conversion from one of the participants in last year's UK Citizens Assembly on the Environment. If you have any suggestions for future handouts, don't hesitate to let us know, and thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So we're going to finish now with a closing prayer. So I'm going to invite Colette again to join us in prayer.
We'll just take a moment to pause and reflect on all that we've heard and all we now intend to take forward this Lent and every day. And David Jackson will lead us into our closing prayer.
Yes, before the prayer, thank you, Colette. A short extract from Paul to the Ephesians. If we live by the truth and in love, we shall grow completely into Christ, who is the head, by whom the whole body is fitted and joined together, every joint adding to its own strength, for each individual part to work according to its function. And so the body grows until it has built itself up in love. And now the prayer. Lord, the people you love are sick. Lord, the earth you love is sick. Give us the wisdom, the strength, health and courage of your Holy Spirit, that, hearing the cries of the poor and of the earth, our common home, we may walk in solidarity and friendship with the poor and bring healing to your creation, for love of you and in the name of God, our merciful Father. Amen.
Okay, thank you very much, Colette and David. That brings us to the end of tonight's webinar. So we hope to see you all here next week at the same place and the same time. So thank you very much, and we'll be sending out the email shortly. So have a good week and God bless.
Good night.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Take care. Bye. Bye.
Great session.
Thank you.